Andree, sorry, I forgot to start the recording, but it is recording now.
That's fine. So generative AI, there seems to be an echo.
I've just muted somebody.
Okay. Generative AI AI has got lots of different types. So there's things like natural language processing, machine learning, etc. And each of the subtypes have got subtypes. So one example of machine learning is artificial neural networks. And the subtypes have got subtypes. So a subtype of artificial neural networks is deep learning. A subtype of deep learning is generative AI. And a subtype of generative AI is large language models. And a subtype of that is generative pre-trained transformers, of which ChatGPT is one. So generative AI is the ability of the algorithms to use existing data and generate new data from components of the existing data. Let me just move to the next slide. So there's lots of different types of data that you can have for generative AI. So ChatGPT, the typical use of it is for text, but it also does code. It can also do images. Versions of it can do images, and there's lots of other ones that do images. We can generate speech, we can generate video. So there's lots of different types of data that you can put in to generative AI to generate information and new data. Oops. So this is actually a simplified example of generative AI, which was generated with generative AI. And so just to explain itself, what it is you've got this database of data. As I said before, the data can be images, it can be text, it can be audio or video. So you've got this database, which all of the different elements are tagged in a particular way, and the model is trained on that data. And so then when you put a prompt into that data, the AI, and it's basically using artificial neural networks, which is the parent type of machine learning, is going to go through all of that data and generate new data from components in that data, and then the output is generated. So ChatGPT is the main one that everyone is very, very familiar with from OpenAI. It's not that new. I know that it seems like it is, but I gave a lecture 3 years ago on GPT-3. We've already got GPT-4. ChatGPT is kind of like a 3.5 version. So this has been going for quite some time, these large language models and GPT, generative pre-trained transformer models. So it's just that that it was made freely available. And so it really generated a lot of interest, but it has been used for a while. And there's lots of companies that are actually doing this. Some of the example use cases are things like it can create content and assist with personalized interactions. So for websites and social media and messaging, it can create personalized messages. So for emails, marketing material, great at synthesizing and summarizing text data. So you can do automated landscapes, landscape assessments. You can do creating dossiers with it. It can explain and tutor, and there's a company called Khan Academy that are an online tutoring company, and they're now using AI to help with their tutoring. It can automate and streamline tasks, so great for Salesforce, data analysis, data entry, planning, research. And it can also write and debug code. But there's a lot of limitations. So some of the limitations are around understanding context. It's not the best at understanding context. So if you can train it and you can put context in, but it's not as good as something like Amelia, which is natural language understanding. It is not the best at it can create long form structured content, but the content breaks down the longer it gets. So it's not as strong for that. It has limitations in handling multiple tasks at once. So if you also change your request halfway through a sentence, it will get lost. And if you do multiple tasks, it might have some trouble prioritizing. Limited knowledge, it's basically going through a database it's been trained on, and it's very limited to what it's been trained on. So ChatGPT was originally trained on data up to 2021. So if you asked a question about something after that, it would make it up because it wasn't in the database, but it would make it up based on the data it had. Potentially biased. Again, with all artificial intelligence, data is of paramount importance, and you need to make sure that there's no bias or limited the bias in the data to make sure that you're not getting a biased response. Accuracy problems. We've got quite a lot of accuracy problems with ChatGPT where, it will make things up, and it will even provide citations that look realistic, but if you actually look them up, they're not real. So that's why if you're using ChatGPT, you always need a human in the loop to check what the output is. Also
I'm in a meeting.
Also in pharmaceuticals. Also in pharmaceuticals, we need to fine tune it because the data that it's been trained on is not necessarily all relevant to what we do and our knowledge base. So when you're using large language models with pharmaceutical use cases, often you need to fine tune it and train it on the kind of data that we need it to understand. And then computational costs and power. It does cost a lot to run in computing costs. And the higher speed computing is going to be more accurate. You can run it on lower output type of computers, but it degrades the accuracy of the output when you do that. So some top tips for using it: really provide clear, simple, and concise instructions. And so if you think about Google Translate, I think it's a similar tip for that. If you put a very complex sentence into Google Translate, it doesn't do so well in the translation. But if you put very straightforward sentences in, the translation's really good. And it's a little bit like that with this, just very clear, simple, concise instructions are important. Also mention the style and format that you want. And if you've got a complex problem, break it down into smaller ones. It's quite interesting. We've tested it with code and it's pretty good. However, if you have a problem that isn't in its database, it can't code it. It just can't come up with new problems. It can't solve new problems with code, which is interesting. Feed it with examples because you can start to train it a bit more, and train, if it comes out with something that that's not right, you can explain to it how you want it improved, and you can provide data if needed. But experiment with different prompts because you will get better accuracy with the better prompts that you use. Also experiment with phrasing and, practice and learn from examples of the best way to put input into it to get the most out of it. But there's a lot of cautions that I need to address. Privacy is a big issue for ChatGPT per se. Rather than not all large language models have this issue, but ChatGPT is a proprietary software from OpenAI. So any data that gets put into ChatGPT goes into the OpenAI database and then could come out in someone else's ChatGPT. So you've got to be aware that you don't put any proprietary information into ChatGPT. There are open source large language models that you can use, and you can train on your own data and you can put in your own secure environment. That's a different situation, but you've just got to be careful who owns the model in terms of whether it's going to be private or not and where you put it. Another issue is what everyone is calling hallucinations, but that's basically made up data. And that's still an issue. And we do see, that quite a bit with ChatGPT. It's, as I said before, very limited to the data it's trained on, but we're seeing a lot of legal issues as well. So data breaches, like I think it was about 2 months ago, someone from Samsung put some proprietary code in there and it came out in other people. So it was a bit of a problem. There's copyright issues, there's defamation lawsuits as well. So just mentioned the Samsung, Samsung is another one. There was a big data breach in March. So anyone who had signed up to OpenAI, the user details and their payment details were actually breached. But then we've also got defamation lawsuits going on right now because it does say untrue things, but sometimes it says it about real people. And so did something that said a politician was jailed for bribery when they weren't. Also said that a professor had sexual assault charges against him and neither were true. So those are 2 defamation lawsuits that are going on right now. Also copyright challenges. There's, a lot of question as to who owns the copyright if it's come from other sources of data. And so obviously most of the data that was used to train these models is copyright data because it's data that someone else has written. So that's becoming a bit of an issue and something that needs to be thought about. As I mentioned, it's not just text that you can have. You can also have audio as well. And I'm just going to, let me just pull up something to show you. I've already queued it. So I'm going to show you a audio that was completely generated with generative AI of Joe Rogan, the podcaster, interviewing experience.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Joe Rogan AI Experience. This is episode number 2, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. I have to remind everyone that every single word in this podcast has been generated by AI using ChatGPT. So this is not me, Joe Rogan, speaking, and these aren't the real voices of the people we'll be talking about. This is just AI technology showcasing what it's capable of. And let me say, it's pretty damn impressive. So let's dive in, sit back, relax, and enjoy this AI-generated experience. But remember, none of this should be taken seriously, and it's for entertainment purposes only. All right, let's do this. How you doing, Mr. President?
Joe, it's great to be here. I'm doing fantastic, just fantastic. The energy in this room is tremendous.
That's great to hear. So, Mr. President, I got to ask you, are you a fan of the UFC?
Joe, let me tell you, I love the UFC. It's one of the most exciting sports out there. It's not for everyone, but if you're a fan, there's nothing like it. The athleticism, the courage, the power, it's just tremendous.
Absolutely.
So just to give you an example of, the sorts of, you would think if you knew those two people that it was their voice. And of course, that brings us to that scam that's going on that most of you must have heard of, where people are getting calls and it looks like it's from their child and they're in trouble and they need money wired to them. They could be kidnapped, they could be in jail. There's all sorts of versions of the scam going on. And sometimes they've stolen a phone and followed that person, recorded just, a minute of their voice, and then they've gone to the contacts and dialed mum or dad, and that's how it happens. But sometimes it happens from other phones. So they'll say, I'm not using my phone because I had to borrow a phone, etc. And I've even got one of those. It's very interesting. I got one where they said that I borrowed someone's phone. And so I think that the power of this is really amazing, but you've also got to be very careful. I think we're moving into a time where we're going to need, and I'm sure there's companies working on this, some kind of blockchain to authenticate our image, our audio, and our audio, video. And that's another scam that I just heard about last week, where faces are being taken off LinkedIn, off social media, and they're being put into porn videos. So now pornographers are actually just using generative AI to create porn videos with real people's faces, just like we saw with this, where the voice isn't them at all. So it's powerful, but it's a double-edged sword. Bad people are doing things with it, but there's a lot of use for good as well. Now, we've also got the European Union's proposed Artificial Intelligence Act. And so this is looking at strengthening the rules around data quality, transparency, human oversight, and accountability, but also it's aiming to address some of the ethical questions and implementation challenges that we have in various sectors, including healthcare. Now, I just took this because I thought this was a nice example. We've got these large language models that can do all sorts of things, but OpenAI, which is up here, is only one, and this is not the entire universe. There's so many different companies doing it. But some of these ones out here, like Hugging Face, we've used Hugging Face. It's actually an amazing company that they are what OpenAI originally intended to do, which is open source. So they create amazing language models, and it's open source. So you can get your data scientists to use it and adapt it and train it and put it in your own environments. So some of the factors to consider when you're evaluating large language models, obviously we talked about the fact that it makes things up. So the authenticity of the answers and how accurate it is important. The speed, some of the models are very, very slow, some are faster. How good the grammar and readability is. Some of them will churn out kind of junk sentences. How unbiased it is, and that goes back to the data that's been used. Backtracking, so that's really knowing the model, the source of the model's inference of what they're doing. Safety and responsibility, you can put guardrails in there, but there is room for improvement. Understanding the context, some of them are not as good at understanding context. Most of them should be good at text operations, so summarizing, translating, doing things like that. How versatile is it? How many domains, specific domains can it actually understand? What languages can it do? Does it have real-time updates? What's the cost? I mean, to develop something from scratch is crazily expensive. If you think about OpenAI, what did they spend? I think it was something like 3.8 billion to get it to where it is now. Consistency, and of course, how much prompt engineering is required. I'm just giving you one or two more examples that I think are interesting. So these are faces that were generated with generative AI, and only one of them is real. I have my suspicion which one it is, but I'm not 100% sure. So with generative AI, as I explained in the beginning, it takes bits of real data. So there are a whole heap of faces it was trained on, and then it takes, the eyes from this one, the nose from this one, and generates new faces. But again, they all look like they're real people. And then I'm going to show you just a quick example of generative AI in a video. So you heard the Joe Rogan and Trump example with the audio, but this is a video example.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
So that just shows you how easy it is to do this with just a small amount of audio and a photo. You can actually generate video that sounds and looks real. You could have people on a Zoom that actually aren't really there. I mean, it's quite frightening how powerful it is. But on the other side of the coin, you can also, and we've done this, get a list of names, like doctors' names, and you can make a video, and the generative AI can put that doctor's name into that video automatically so that it looks like you've done these personalized videos just for that doctor. So there's a lot of use cases for it that are actually quite powerful and quite useful for sales and marketing in particular. But I'm going to show you a whole heap of different areas soon where we can use it in pharma. But I just want to give you, I used this in a training a few years ago, and I just thought it was a nice way to explain it. So it was invented in 2014 by a British data scientist. And what he was doing was creating a discriminator algorithm because he wanted an algorithm to train an algorithm to detect the difference between real data and fake data. And so this is where the whole generator in generative AI began. He took all this real data and he created this algorithm of generating data using the real sample. And then he fed it into the discriminator to get the algorithm to test whether it could actually distinguish the difference. So this was the very first generative AI, but it's certainly not the only one. Now we've got many different models of generative AI. So we've got the generative adversarial networks, that one I just showed you. And then we've got recurrent neural networks, variational autoencoders, deep reinforcement learning, and the transformer models like GPT. So which one you use depends on what you're trying to do and what the data is and what results you're trying to find. So I've just got, I'll go into these in a lot more detail, but just as an overview, one of the big areas is in R&D and drug discovery. So creating new drugs, it can actually make molecules that are specifically designed to deal with certain diseases or health problems, and it can actually get them to work better and be safer. And you can also make it so they are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted more effectively. It can also improve drug candidate and lead optimization. So it can help by making new molecules that are similar to a drug candidate, but have better properties. And then these new molecules can then be made and tested to see if they're safe and how well they work. finding new uses, drug repurposing. We've seen a lot of that being done during COVID. So looking at FDA or EMA approved drugs and saying which of these are going to be the ones that work for this particular condition. And then you can use generative AI to actually make new molecules within days that are similar to existing drugs, but work slightly differently. And then you can test them. Creating personalized medicines, can actually help create personalized drugs by making molecules designed for specific subgroups of patients. And then, of course, in clinical trials, we can actually figure out which attributes of patients are going to respond better to certain treatments and, train it to look at genetic markers. So I'm just going to pull out, this is a slide I used in 2020, but I was asked to speak about AI and COVID. And I think this is a really good example because all of these were generative AI. So Deargen in South Korea used AI to look at which of the FDA approved medications is most likely to work with COVID. And they came up with atazanavir and also remdesivir. Benevolent AI, another company, identified 6 compounds out of ones that they were existing already FDA approved. And they thought baricitinib looked like the best. I looked back at this slide about 2 years ago when I was giving another talk, and I checked the clinical trials. And what was interesting was both atazanavir and baricitinib both were very effective against COVID. And what was even more interesting is if you combined the cocktail of the two of them, it was even more powerful and more effective. Then on the other side of the coin, we had in silico medicine, and they were basically saying, okay, we're not looking at repurposing drugs, but we want to generate a new drug. And so they basically generated tens of thousands of novel molecules that could have the potential to bind the protein and block the virus' ability to replicate. And then they filtered it down to 100 molecules after 4 days, which is amazing. And then SRI Biosciences and Ictos, they're 2 separate companies, but they actually work together. And one of them, Ictos, basically designed the molecules, and SRI have something called SynFini, which is their synthetic chemistry platform, and that figured out the best way to do it. And working together, they actually were able to create and test new drug-like molecules in 1 to 2 weeks. So I think that this is one of the things, I'll talk about this a bit more, but this is an area that pharma companies are really getting into, and AstraZeneca have been doing quite a bit of work in this space as well. And I think most companies will start to move their R&D into this space because it means that we are able to do things so much faster. And, this whole 10 years to get a drug to market will be able to be really condensed from this, but more other areas as well, which I can talk about. So how is it used in pharma? There's lots of different areas. So I've already given you some examples of drug discovery. Even the large language model types of generative AI can basically analyze huge amounts of data from research papers, clinical trials, whatever sources you put in, to identify patterns and insights that can inform drug discovery and help identify the new targets and predict the efficacy and safety. This is something that's going to really speed up drug development, discovery and development. The only issue, if we're looking at something like ChatGPT, is that we need clean, complete, and accurate data. And unfortunately, with ChatGPT, it's not always providing accurate summaries. But some of the custom generative AI models do. And I even suspect that in time, ChatGPT and GPT-4 and 5 and 6 will all start to improve in that space. I found this interesting because it's showing the drug discovery market in generative AI. And the prediction is that it's just going to start growing dramatically. We're not huge in terms of the number of pharma using it right now, but it's really starting to grow, and for obvious reasons. It's going to save a lot of money, save a lot of time, get drugs to market faster. And if you look at how much data a single patient produces every year, this is just the average. Some patients produce a lot more. So we've got electronic health data, we've got wearable data, health claims data, pharmacy, clinical trials, genome, medical imaging, disease registry. Think of all the generative data that we can get and all the insights we can get just from this data, and then we can generate more. We've done that with rare disease. When they don't have enough patients to do it, you can generate new data and actually do a lot of research. And even we've used it in sales and marketing with with rare disease as well, which I can explain later. But so many uses. Clinical trial is another area, predictive analysis, because it can analyze vast amounts of patient data. It can actually look at potential risks and predict treatment outcomes. And we do have companies like Zephyr AI. I interviewed them on my podcast, and they do that. They're only doing it in oncology and diabetes at the moment, but they use generative AI to basically analyze the clinical trial before you even do it. So you know pretty much what the result's going to be before you even start your trials. And then efficient data management, by automating the processing of all this large amount of data, the clinical trial staff can focus on other parts of their work. We can have improved patient engagement, so they could actually have interaction with it. They can get personalized information and support during their journey. We can have automated reporting, and this has been done for a long time now, at least 8 years, where AI has been automatically writing the clinical study reports. They're not, as I say, accurate, 100% accurate. So they write them, it can do it to about 80 to 90% of the report can be written, not 100% yet. And I say yet, but also you do need a human to check it, because as you know, accuracy is vital in all the things that we do. And things like Sam Altman, from the CEO of OpenAI, points out very, very many times that it can be very inaccurate. Now that could change, but I just recommend caution for that. But it can certainly speed up a lot of the processes. And then, of course, pharmacovigilance, it's being used, not ChatGPT per se, but large language models are being used in pharmacovigilance. Glaxo are doing very good stuff with generative AI for pharmacovigilance globally. So it's holding a lot of promise for drug safety monitoring. It can monitor adverse events. It can identify safety concerns, can identify drug interactions, side effects. It can even do the reconciliation. There's so many things that it can do. It can also take a next level to the text mining in pharmacovigilance. So it can review case reports to find the ADRs in seconds in ways that would take a human so much longer. But vigilance is part of the word pharmacovigilance. And so again, always everything should really be checked by a human at this point, because we're not at the point that I would feel comfortable that it was never checked, because you never know what gets in. Patient care is another, and patient customer service engagement, another area that's really good use of this kind of thing. A lot of the chatbots, and I'm not talking about digital humans, but the chatbot technology is not as great as the doctor and nurse, for example. But you can develop these virtual assistants that can do part of the job. They can do medication management, they can do symptom tracking. So they can do some of the job that could release some of the burden from the healthcare providers. And possibly for diagnosis and treatment, there's other types of AI that are much more powerful for diagnosis and treatment, other types of deep learning. But Google and DeepMind are already doing MedPalm, which is a medical query tool. And there's actually others. There's Consensus, which is a really good one and really accurate. So there are ones out there. I did an article a few weeks ago, about 4 weeks ago, on handy AI tools. And I actually pulled out some of the ones that were good for literature reviews and things like that, that are highly accurate, unlike ChatGPT. So the data has to be accurate, of course, for accurate output. But even if you've got good data, it depends on how good the model is that you're using. Regulatory, we're doing so many projects in regulatory with large language models right now. So there's lots of different things that you can do, including putting together your drug approval submissions, predictive modeling, even guidance changes. So, the World Health Organization guidance comes in and you've got to change your dossier. It can do a lot of things like that. But regulatory is legal. And so we need to be careful, because there's already these copyright issues of things that are coming out of ChatGPT. And so we need to be very mindful of where some of the pitfalls can be. At the moment, we haven't seen any, touch wood, but there could be things that come up that we've just got to be very careful of with that as well. Medical writing's an obvious one. Again, it would need to be checked. And again, you're going to have issues around authorship and integrity. You never know if there was a copyright claim, so you've got to be very careful with that. But also keep in mind that it does make up lots of things, and it makes up references. So something looks really impressive and it's got the reference and the reference looks good, but when you check the reference, it doesn't exist. So again, caution. And sales and marketing, I think it's going to change the landscape of sales and marketing in lots of different ways, because so many of the use cases that are being used in most industries are in sales and marketing. And the fact that we can personalize videos to doctors, even to patients, all of these things with the press of a button means that, the writing can be done with it, videos can be done with it. And there's a company called Runway, which I really am impressed with. And they have a new generative AI that hasn't been released yet, but I've seen a pre-release demo. Amazing videos. I mean, some of the videos, I've tried lots of different video generative AI, and they're not that exciting. But the Runway Gen 2 is amazing. I mean, movie quality videos that it's making, which of course is getting a lot of discussion in Hollywood right now because, the writers were on strike because they're using ChatGPT and things like that, and they're worried they're going to lose their job. And I did interview a very interesting company, Charisma AI, and they are using AI to change how a movie works. So you interact and your reactions during a movie can actually change the whole course of the movie. So we're moving into an era where even movies will be different experiences for different people. Some of the advantages of using generative AI for pharma are obviously R&D and discovery. If we've got really ultra rare disease, generating more rare disease patient data is a big use. And also clinical trials. We could actually use generative AI to decrease the control arm size because, it's a bit worrying in some conditions where you're giving the patient a placebo. So you could actually minimize that. Great for sales and marketing. Fills in the gaps. Often in AI, you're given data and there's gaps and missing data in that, particularly if you're doing something with CRM data. So many of the CRM systems data that we've been given has a lot of missing data. But now we can actually fill in gaps in data with generative AI and actually get much stronger model accuracy. We can use it for improved data privacy. I'm not saying ChatGPT is good for privacy, but you can use it, these kind of generative AI, for stronger data privacy and improved compliance. And it is less expensive than collecting real patient data. Some of the challenges that we're seeing are the quality of the data. If the data quality is not good, then it's going to make bad insights and predictions. And that also leads into data bias. There's often lots of bias in the data to train the AI. So it's very important to think about these issues and use the AI responsibly. And then there's also ethical issues around how it could be misused. And I was thinking about this, and it's a weird example, but we could actually use it to make drugs. Someone could just make drugs without actually doing the proper tests. Obviously, a pharmaceutical company wouldn't do that, but you could have, someone just in a little corner shop, basically just churning out drugs that actually aren't really tested. So you can see how things could go in that direction if we're not careful. Understanding it. One of the challenges with generative AI is sometimes, and that was one of the things I said you need to look at with the models, it's, ChatGPT is one of these where they can't really explain why it comes up with the output it comes up with. And that's a challenge in our industry because we need to be able to explain how things work. And I know that firsthand because every project we do, I'm usually the person explaining it to legal and compliance, and they want to know what's the hypothesis behind the algorithms, what's the data, where's the data, who owns the data. So all of those kinds of things are things that are important to get through legal and compliance. And generative AI does have a few things that are much more difficult to explain depending on the model you're using. So we need to be careful of that. And of course, we've got so many rules and regulations that we need to follow. And getting generative AI approved by legal and compliance takes longer in many cases because it doesn't have that transparency for all of the models that are out there. And then ownership, data ownership is another area. Who owns the rights to a drug that's made with generative AI? Now, that hasn't come under contest yet for, companies like Moderna and all of those companies that have done this. But who knows? That's something to really keep in mind. And then using it with current systems, we really do need to do this properly, particularly for R&D, really high-level computing. And a lot of the systems, the legacy systems in pharma, aren't really ideal for it. You can always rent high-level computing, but you might need to, as a pharma company, actually buy new equipment and software to use it. And expertise, it's really basically a subtype of machine learning, but it requires high-level expertise. So you need to hire people with the right skills in machine learning, artificial neural, all that whole line of subtype of subtype of subtype, which is all under deep learning. And then it can be very costly. As I said, OpenAI spent 3.8 billion, I think it was, to develop what they've done. The way that you can get around that is using companies like Hugging Face and some of the ones that are really committed to having open source code that anyone can use. And then you can use that as your base, and you can train it on your data and put it in your environment and improve it and make it fine-tuned. So compliance. AI all requires data, and that means that there's a lot of issues. We need to be very careful about the data that we're using, where it is, how good it is, what the veracity is, and where the data source is from, who owns the data. We need to be compliant with all our regulations. And there are many ways that we can use it and stay compliant, but the privacy laws are constantly changing. I was at a For Humanity AI event in January, and there were so many regulations that are being proposed in Europe right now. And there was one, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, if that comes in, a lot of the pharma next best action omni-channel models are maybe not compliant. So it's a constantly changing thing. And whenever you're doing an AI project, you really need cooperation with your legal and compliance teams. And then we've got the AI Act. It's all about what are the risks. So I just put some of the ones here. So I'm lecturing in AI at Henley Business School, and they've got me doing a debate in October, I think it is, with the government proposing these laws. So I'm a bit concerned how it's going to go. But basically, looking into it, it's really, these are the kind of areas that we can't do anymore once this comes in. So no subliminal techniques or anything manipulative or deceptive, of course. Anything exploiting vulnerabilities of individuals or specific groups. Any biometric categorization systems based on sensitive attributes or characteristics. Anything for social scoring or evaluating trustworthiness. Anything for risk assessment, predicting criminal or administrative offenses. I mean, I wish that was actually global, because I did see in China, the government have developed an algorithm that they say they can predict from a child and what information about a child, whether they're going to commit a crime when they grow up. And that kind of scares me, that kind of, it's not good. So at least in Europe, we've put that aside with this, but in other countries, that's actually being looked at. It has been done in China. AI systems for creating or expanding facial recognition databases through untargeted scraping. We did a project a very long time ago in rare disease where we were using face recognition to find these babies so that they could get diagnosed, and it saved lives because they would die at the age of 10 if they weren't found. But I don't think we would be allowed to do that anymore based on this, because we were doing scraping of images online. AI systems inferring emotions in law enforcement, border control, workplace and education. And interestingly, it's specifying that developers of foundation models need to ensure that their training data doesn't violate copyright law. I don't know how that's possible. I don't think that's actually even possible. So that's an interesting point, because the training data is, you need billions of data points for this training data. And if you look at OpenAI, it basically scraped everything from the internet up to the end of 2021. Most of that was copyright. So most of these foundation models have been trained, at least the text ones, but even the art ones, all of the different ones have been trained on data that typically is copyright data. So I don't know how this is going to work, but it's a very interesting area to look at. So can it create real disruption? I think a lot of content creation jobs will change, or some of them will go, but the real disruption will come from generative AI's ability to effortlessly create both new data for R&D and new code and optimize productivity very fast. And so this speed of change, I think, will be the real disruption. And I think part of the interesting part for us is that this will actually improve a lot of areas in pharma. You know, we've got lots of challenges because cost so much and take so long to get a drug to market, but that is going to get shorter and shorter with all of this generative AI. And of course, clinical trials as well will be faster. There's a prediction I read that by the end of next year, 60% of all data used for AI will be generative data. And I have a prediction that, you know, in the next 10 years, pharma won't be using real people data because synthetic data, I'm not talking about the pre-trained transformer model, but some of these other ones where we're creating synthetic data is so accurate and so strong in R&D and clinical trials that we'll get to the point like cars are now. You know, when I was younger, cars used to be crash tested, and then they changed the model and crash test them with mathematics. We're getting to the point eventually, you know, maybe in 20 or 30 years where we'll have digital twins that we can test data on. But I think generative data is going to make a big difference in everything we do. And particularly with all these privacy laws that are coming through, we don't want to use real people data because it's so much harder to get it through all sorts of ethics committees and legal and compliance. Using generative data is going to mean that we're not infringing anyone's privacy or copyright or anything else. So very, very interesting. So that's it. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much. I think there's lots and lots of questions in the chat box. Thank you so much. That was an extremely comprehensive presentation, Andree, as expected. There are a number of questions, and we have about 10 minutes, I think, Andree, before we let you go.
Yeah, well, close to 15.
Okay, so we have, first of all, I'd have to let you know that Edward Bataga, who's also on the call, he was the first person who introduced me to ChatGPT. And I was pretty much blown away. Edward, do you remember that? Yeah. And I still, you know, I'm struggling a little bit with, you know, how to use it, when to use it, and everything. Deborah, you had your hand up, is that right? Deborah, do you have a question?
No, I don't. I was
okay. Okay, we have Rajesh, you have asked a number of questions, so I'm going to unmute you and you should shoot.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Andree, Dr. Bates, really thank you so much. Let me start with the last one, actually. That in pharma, I mean, there's a lot of optimizing being done. People are working on reducing operational expenses. I think that's probably the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And I took the example of medical writing. Do you see, for example, because you see the thing is because you employ medical writers because they are qualified, they are PhD folks. I personally recruited so many in Hyderabad when we set up the outsourced facility for Novartis. Yeah. And so how would this change, not just for medical writing, but also for, you know, the outsourced components of business processes for pharma per se?
Yeah, it's a good question. But I'll give you an example that I think is pertinent to that. I mean, obviously, we hire very highly qualified people in pharma. But the thing with AI is you can put all of that data that has trained those highly qualified people into AI to train the AI. And so I think of that with, I didn't show Amelia in this talk, but in other talks, I've showed Amelia a digital human, and I always describe her as a super brilliant intern. You know, until you train her, she doesn't know anything, but you put that data in and train her on that data, and she's as qualified as anyone else. So there was a really interesting comparison made where scans of tumors were shown to a panel of 5 top oncologists, and it was compared with showing those same tumor scans to AI. Now, the oncologists were really top oncologists who had seen, you know, I don't know how many cases in their life, hundreds of thousands maybe, but even combined, they hadn't seen the number of cases that the AI had been trained on, which is, you know, billions of cases. And so the AI was able to predict the progression of tumors with 86% accuracy, and the combined doctors was 73%. So we will get to the point that, and we are at that point, that these models can be as good as the humans. However, depending on the model, you've got to be careful. So for these pre-trained transformer models, you do need to check it. And I would at this stage still say check everything because we have to be super cautious. But it certainly is getting to the point that we will probably be doing new jobs as opposed to the old. So the medical writers may become more specialist in putting prompts in rather than actually doing the writing. So I think that the nature of the jobs will change. It will be more of a overseeing and inputting as opposed to actually churning out the output.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Andree, where, as a general question, in your opinion, which country today is really at the forefront of AI, generative AI? Is it the US, or the parts of Europe, or is it perhaps China? China. So
China.
That brings me to a question which has been asked by Moses. Moses, when are you on the call still? Let me just see where you are, Moses. Are you on the call? I don't see you. He was asking, is there any evidence that China, I also, by the way, tend to believe that China is in fact at the forefront. Moses, I'm just going to unmute you if you want to ask your question. I'm not sure if he's, Moses, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Go ahead. Ask your question, please.
So thanks a lot, Dr. Andree. So I want to ask about, because you mentioned about the Chinese government already invent a kind of AI model that can predict the crime.
Yeah.
So actually, I want to know the reference about it.
I can get that to you. I don't have it with me right now, but I can get you that. It was very interesting. They collected a whole heap of different data. And I mean, it's basically trained like like any other AI model. They're basically looking, I mean, we do this with medical record data to identify which patients will get to a certain place. So you're looking at, in their case, they would be looking at people who committed crimes. They'd be looking at all of the different attributes around those people, and then they were back tracing it. But I'll find the reference and I'll give it to Salman to give to
Moses,
you.
yeah, Moses, just get in touch with me, please. Send me a DM and I'll take it up. Thank you. Ian, you had a question. I'm going to unmute you. Ian, are you there?
Yes, yeah. I'm here. Thank you so much. This has been an awesome talk. I suppose I'm coming at it from a slightly pessimistic view, and apologies, but maybe it's a view that other people have in their heads. And it's one of, if I, as an individual, or I as a corporation, wanted to introduce erroneous data so that the generative AI models tried to kind of scour everything and therefore introduced what I'm calling like a toxic data set, how are we going to stop that? Or will we be able to program the AI to recognize toxic data sets, so therefore they're not used as part of the whole data set, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very interesting area because that was where the British scientists that invented generative adversarial networks started. And it was really creating this generative data so that the discriminator algorithm could distinguish the difference. But it's a very important topic because in any AI project, all the ones we've ever done, the biggest part of any project is really making sure that you've got the right data and checking it for biases and making sure it's, fair and representative data sample. And it's also the hardest part, it's the longest and most time-consuming part of any AI project. And you wouldn't want to introduce erroneous data into it, but if it was introduced, then yes, it could cause all of the garbage in, garbage out. If the data is not good, you're not going to get good predictions in it. So it's something that we are always trying to guard against. But we do have algorithms that can identify some, but maybe not all. But that probably will improve over time.
Thank you so much. Peter, we have perhaps time for one or two other questions. Peter, I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to ask your question, Peter?
Yes, with regard to the examples that you're giving. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It's a very good, concise overview of where we are. There are, of course, bits and pieces in your story where we'll have to see, if this lives up to the expectation. And in pharmaceutical R&D, we have seen many revolutions in the past where we said, now we will accelerate and things will become cheaper. And things have not become cheaper. They only have become slower. and we're still not very successful. And the examples that you gave, like benevolent AI and also in silico medicine, of course, are all over, but there soon will meet clinical reality. And I'm just wondering, what is your view on this? You mentioned also in clinical trials we can improve, but you also mentioned two things very important in the beginning. You know, AI, ChatGPT is not going to solve problems it doesn't know.
Yeah.
It can use existing knowledge. And for instance, in predicting molecules, we know very little about the all the physicochemical properties that, you know, make a good drug. And what we also have seen is that we are been very successful in the last 20 years to bring drugs into phase 1, which are safe, but not effective. So where do we stand there?
I think that I don't think the generative pre-transformer models are the best for that. I think, you know, recurrent neural networks, some of those other models are actually stronger for this area, but we are seeing really impressive things being done. I mean, just those COVID examples, just as a start. So we can bring that, you know, molecule screening down dramatically. And so there's lots of areas where we can save time. I think it's a little bit like Rajesh's question for medical writing. You know, I think that we will be able to do a lot with it, but we will still need a human checking and a human making sure the data that's going in is right. It's very interesting, you know, technology changes jobs. And a question I get asked all the time is, you know, is my job going to go? And I think that a lot of our jobs are going to change, but it's not that they're going to go. It's going to be about using the AI to do the chunk that we used to do, but the specialist knowledge will be in checking the right data and checking the output. So it will be just, you know, we'll kind of be pivoting slightly in the way that we work with it in the years to come. But it is interesting, you know, the last 20 years, so many things haven't changed so much that have been so frustrating to me, where I've thought 20 years time, it'll be like this, and it hasn't. But at the same time, since 2017 in particular, you know, that was the pivotal year where we had more data generated in that year than the whole history of mankind before that. And since we've got to that level of data, the AI has had so much more data to work with. So our AI knowledge is going up pretty logarithmically right now. So that's going at quite a speed.
Thank you. I have one final question I'm going to ask Norbert, because Norbert, there's so many experts in this call, so many experts with great backgrounds and everything, scientific backgrounds, medical doctors, and Norbert is also an HCD member who has a lot of experience in diagnostics. Norbert, do you have a question regarding, or do you have any comments regarding the use of generative AI in diagnostics?
Thanks, Salman,
and
for
Norbert
the
has
floor.
Norbert has also written a book, by the way, on that.
Yes, mostly from pricing, reimbursement, market access perspective. Andree, fantastic presentation. I personally tried ChatGPT as well. You know, I was trying to have different use cases. No questions, rather comments that we see definitely in diagnostics, that there are many kind of like algorithms, prognostic algorithms happening, where they try to combine different kind of like data from variables, from blood-based biomarkers, from different genomic tests to kind of like stratify patients. So maybe this is something where there are good databases. Potentially AI could help. Personally, I'm carefully watching the entire debate and field. I'm not pro, I'm not con. No questions, very good presentation. It's just more like a comment whether you see that maybe it's happening on an accelerated way in biomarker, digital biomarker development. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's a more positive note that we are going to be finishing on, right, Andree?
Yes.
So it goes beyond pharma.
Yeah. Well, you know, that whole diagnostics and pharma are a lock and a key, aren't they?
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, your time and your plane. Thank you so much. We will have the recording available to at least the Basel HCD group. We'll have to see how we can make it available also to the other chapters. Yeah, we will have the presentation, we'll have this presentation on our closed-in LinkedIn site. So thank you so much once again. You've earned your lunch once again and your dinner, Andree. All the best to you. Thank you so
very much. Fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.